African Airlines recorded a 13.6% rise in international passenger demand in April 2025 compared to the previous year, signaling strong recovery, according to IATA. Capacity increased by 8.9%, but the region posted the lowest load factor globally at 76.3%, highlighting inefficiencies and untapped potential. While global air travel rebounded, with Asia, Pacific and Europe leading in growth and load factors above 84%, Africa's aviation sector still faces hurdles, including infrastructure gaps, limited connectivity and policy constraints. Sean Mendis, aviation consultant, joins me now for the conversation. It's great to have you in.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, a pleasure. This is apparently some sort of a rebound for Africa. Give us a picture of the position Africa was in, before when it comes to international passenger demand, and perhaps what is driving this growth, per se, year-on-year growth in international passenger demand for African airlines.
Well, I think the exceptional growth that we've seen, 13-point-something% year on year, is actually a bit of an anomaly. The reality is that in the immediate post-COVID environment, we saw that the two largest markets in Africa, which are basically Nigeria and South Africa, were very depressed, and this was due to economic factors. South Africa had South African Airways in bankruptcy and just restructuring itself. Nigeria, as you well know, had a serious economic crisis in the immediate post-COVID times, where international airlines in particular were badly affected as they were unable to repatriate their funds from ticket sales. So the market had been depressed, and I think now, as South Africa and South African Airways are recovering better, and the Nigerian economy is stabilizing relatively, this is beginning to get consumer confidence up a bit more, and consequently, we're seeing a recovery to a level where it really should have been maybe a year or two ago, but it seems to have jumped up a lot more in the last 12 months, which is why we're seeing these staggering figures of 13.6 annual growth.
All right. It's interesting that we're linking this recovery to COVID. Are you saying that we are only just recovering from the, should I say, depression of COVID when it comes to international passenger demand for Africa? And why has it taken 5 years?
Yeah, I think that is unfortunately the reality. If you're looking in terms of the peak in most African markets, that peak really remains 2019 in almost all markets. I think just the first few markets are beginning to reach and exceed their 2019 levels in 2024. So yes, the reality is that Africa's recovery was, the initial recovery from Africa was strong, but then it slowed down and didn't quite experience the strong recovery in 2021, 22, 23 that the rest of the world did. So Africa has lagged, but I think 25 is the year where Africa has effectively caught back up to global trends. But that 24 to 25 jump is where we're seeing that excessive growth, which is more of the anomaly.
All right. Quite some development there. And you're saying 2025 is the year that we expect strong rebounds. Despite increased demand and capacity, Africa is still, we still recorded the lowest load factor at 76.3%. What would you say are the challenges that are contributing to this underperformance in seat occupancy?
Absolutely, and I think that is something which African airlines need to learn from. The global standard is in the early to mid 80% as an industry standard in terms of what airlines should target. I think where the problem we largely go wrong in Africa is that a lot of airlines, and I'll name government-owned airlines particularly, have a fixation on flying big planes. There are a lot of markets in Africa which are ideally suited to having smaller aircraft, having 50 to 100 seat range aircraft to properly support the size of the market they're flying in. But African governments in particular like to see large planes painted in the national colors flying half empty to London, Dubai, and Paris. And consequently, you wind up wasting a lot of taxpayer money, hurting African airlines, but this reflects then in the significantly lower system-wide load factors that Africa produces relative to other regions of the world. And that includes developing market regions of the world like Southeast Asia, Latin America, etc., which have similar economic conditions to Africa, but still are able to develop much stronger load factor demand. And I think that is because they are mostly driven by commercial considerations rather than the political considerations that so many African carriers, which are slaves to government ownership or government control, are having to deliver.
They were a little overambitious with the fixation on the size of a plane that we're carrying. We're not meeting our local demand, apparently cutting our coats not according to our cloth. So what do you think? I mean, let's come to the opportunities that this perhaps rebound could present for foreign, local investors in Africa's aviation and tourism sector. Let us into that.
African aviation remains probably the most exciting sector for anyone looking to invest or develop aviation projects. The potential here is infinite, and the reason that it is infinite is because the ground infrastructure is really lagging. You can't really send a truck from Nigeria to South Africa because the roads aren't there, the rail system isn't developed, and consequently, air freight becomes the way that you can stimulate trade. It becomes a way that you have to travel between different countries. So air traffic has a disproportionate influence on African development, and on the African air transport market in general becomes more, has more potential as a result. So I think the main challenges that we have in Africa in terms of being able to realize that have been access to capital. A lot of African countries tend to restrict investment in the airline industry, focus on 51% domestic ownership, restrict foreign owners. There's also a very fragmented market. Despite all the discussion about the single African air transport market, there are still 50-something different regulatory regimes in the continent. So simply flying between Nigeria and Ghana often requires having to fly across 4 different countries' airspaces and get a whole range of permissions and things. African governments have tended to view air traffic as something for the elite and have taxed it accordingly. Consequently, you see that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you tax air traffic as only for the elite are able to afford it. So I think there are a number of different considerations which are stifling it, but I think if we're able to resolve these in packets, we'll be able to really get a kickstart for African aviation to realize its true potential.
And I think you should pick up from there. You have highlighted the efforts that need to be made to ease things up in that sector from the government side of things. You've highlighted tax. What other things need to be done to see more growth within that sector across Africa?
I think just the ease of doing business is very critical. It's another thing which I tend to talk about a lot is that an African airline has what I call a 30% Africa tax. When you are running an airline in Africa and say you need to get spare parts for your plane, if you're based in Miami, you can just drive down the road to one of 50 different vendors based at Miami Airport and buy your parts from there, and your plane is fixed within 2 hours. If you're based in Africa, you've got to order the parts from a depot probably in Europe or Dubai or somewhere, and then you've got to wait 2 days for it to come by DHL or FedEx, and then it's got to go through a customs clearance process. And, when you add all that in, the time it takes for where your plane is grounded, the additional costs that you're paying, this is a 30% tax to African airlines, which raises costs above what operators in more advanced markets are able to realize. So again, this is where we need manufacturers to develop depots within the within the continent to develop better support systems for governments to take down these artificial barriers and so forth, and just make life easier for people who are looking to try and deliver a product which will benefit not just economies but individual consumers and just basically society as a whole.
I mean, definitely specific solutions for us here in Africa. But let's also see, I mean, given the global increase in international air travel, do you see that also trickling down to Africa? And how can African airlines perhaps better position themselves to compete with carriers from Asia Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East?
I think, African airlines really don't need to compete with carriers from the rest of the world. African airlines have a unique advantage in that they are the players who are best able to serve the African market. You can have an Emirates, for example, flying in from Dubai to Lagos, but if you've got a passenger who needs to go beyond Lagos to Kaduna, to Enugu, or from Accra to Kumasi, Tamale, etc., all these secondary points, those have to be served by African airlines who are able to partner with these international carriers rather than compete with them. And I think that is where, a lot of African airlines, again, as I go back to there's the fixation on big planes and big name markets rather than focusing on areas where African airlines have a unique advantage, which is their own backyard. If you dominate your domestic market, you will always have a platform on which you're able to grow out, but starting to compete on a global basis before you're actually able to compete in your own backyard is a recipe for disaster. These other airlines are successful because they built up their home bases, because they built up their history of solid reputations, and African airlines have to do that. You need to walk before you run, you need to run before you fly. Even an aircraft takes 1 kilometer of runway before it's got enough speed to take to the air. And I think that is primarily what African airlines need to focus on. Get your speed in your engines fully revved up on the runway before you start expecting it to take to the air.
Interesting. Dominate your local market and instead of competing, perhaps partner. Let's come to matters around trade. We know that has been a major issue, global trade tensions and all of that. We know that cargo demand as well has also dipped significantly in the past, especially in February specifically. So, I mean, how are the rising trade tensions, the macroeconomics also affecting the sector as a whole?
Well, we're definitely seeing that demand has softened transatlantic. Now, that is business-driven demand between the U.S. and Europe primarily. There's also, I think the U.S. market in general has softened on the business front. Has that affected Africa? Yes and no. I think we've seen that flights out of gateways other than Washington, D.C. to Africa have actually tended to maintain or even increase slightly in terms of demand. But demand from Washington to a lot of points in Africa, that is to, I've seen that in the Ghana market, I've seen that in the South Africa market, but Washington demand has significantly dropped. And I think a big reason for that is that the U.S. government's cut back on U.S. aid spending and, general isolationism under the current administration is definitely hurting U.S. government-funded traffic between North America and Africa, which did account for, while not a majority, definitely a significant chunk of that. But I think that the general commercial market, the tourist traffic, the business traffic, and so forth, I think that is largely continuing as expected. But obviously, the overall market growth is not going to be the same, and we're seeing this in terms of capacity cuts, even in terms of African airlines. I was just looking at Ethiopian Airlines' schedules to North America for the rest of the year this week, and they have trimmed frequencies on some routes down. Where they used to fly maybe 5 times a week, they're flying 4 and 3 times a week. On their Washington flights where they've been flying the huge, their largest plane, the A350-1000, they've cut that back on some days to a slightly smaller A350-900. So we're definitely seeing weakening demand in some of the U.S. transatlantic markets, and I think that is largely being driven due to government funding travel being significant.
It would be interesting to track how developments continue. Thank you very much, Sean Mendis, aviation consultant, for joining me for today's conversation. A pleasure.